On the morning of January 22, 1943, at 9:17, Second Lieutenant John George positioned himself within the debris of a Japanese fortification located west of Point Cruz. Through a scope that his fellow officers had ridiculed for 6 weeks, he observed a banyan tree 240 yards distant. 27 years of age, a state champion from Illinois, yet possessing 0 confirmed eliminations. Operating within the Point Cruz groves were 11 Japanese snipers who, during the preceding 72 hours, had eliminated 14 soldiers from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's rifle had been labeled a plaything by his commanding officer. His platoon leaders mockingly referred to it as his mail-order companion. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, when he had unwrapped the Winchester Model 70, equipped with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount, the armorer questioned whether the weapon was intended for deer or Germans. George clarified its purpose was for engaging the Japanese. Their deployment occurred before the rifle's arrival. Throughout the voyage to Guadalcanal, George observed other soldiers maintaining their Garands while his personal weapon remained stored in an Illinois warehouse. Through military postal channels, he requested its forwarding. 6 weeks later, in late December of 1942, a supply sergeant delivered to him a wooden crate bearing fragile markings. The crate contained the rifle for which he had saved 2 years of National Guard wages to purchase. The rifle's weight measured 9 pounds. An additional 12 ounces came from the scope. Every other soldier in his battalion carried a Garand weighing 9.5 pounds without magnification capability. George's weapon operated as bolt action with 5-round capacity. The Garand functioned semi-automatically with 8 rounds. Captain Morris commanded him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a proper weapon. George defied this order and carried it regardless. In late December of 1942, the 132nd Infantry had replaced the Marines on Guadalcanal. Since August, the Marines had been engaged in combat. They had captured Henderson Field and maintained control, yet Mount Austin remained untaken, and the Japanese presence in the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River persisted. Mount Austin rose to 1,514 feet in elevation. The Japanese designated it the Gifu. 500 soldiers, 47 fortifications. On December 17th, George's battalion launched their assault. Combat continued for 16 days. 34 men were killed and 279 wounded before they finally secured the western slope on January 2nd. By that point, George had discharged his Winchester precisely 0 times during combat operations. The jungle surrounding Point Cruz presented different conditions. No fortifications existed, no established positions, merely Japanese soldiers who had withdrawn westward from Henderson Field and established themselves among the massive trees. Among those soldiers were snipers, equipped with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They possessed jungle knowledge and understood the art of patience. On January 19th, a sniper eliminated Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 soldiers from L Company during patrol operations. On January 21st, 3 additional fatalities occurred. 1 victim was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had passed twice. That evening, the battalion commander summoned George. Japanese snipers were eliminating his soldiers at a rate exceeding malaria casualties. He required someone capable of accurate shooting and wanted confirmation that the mail-order rifle could actually strike targets. George explained his qualifications. The Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. At 23 years of age at that time, he was the youngest winner in the state's recorded history. 6-inch groupings at 600 yards using iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan, 5 rounds grouped within 4 inches at 300 yards, the commander granted him until morning to demonstrate his capability. To discover how George's civilian rifle performed against Japanese snipers trained for jungle combat, please press that like button. It assists us in sharing additional forgotten narratives like this one. And please subscribe if you have not done so already. Returning to George's story. George devoted the night to inspecting his rifle. The Winchester had been preserved in Cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it once more, verified the scope mounts, and loaded 5 rounds of .306 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee. Military ball ammunition, the identical cartridge fired by the Garand. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position within the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days prior. The bunker provided oversight of the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reported that Japanese snipers operated from the large trees in that vicinity, banyan trees. Some reached 90 feet in height, with trunks 8 feet in thickness. A sniper could ascend one of those trees before sunrise and remain positioned all day without detection. George had brought no spotter, no radio operator, only his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and commenced observing the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan provided 2.5 power magnification, not substantial, but sufficient to observe movement in the branches that would escape naked eye detection. The jungle maintained constant sound: birds, insects, the distant reports of artillery. George had mastered filtering out the noise and concentrating on movement. He examined the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 he observed it. A branch shifted. No wind existed, just a minor displacement. 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George continued observing. The branch moved once more. Then the shape became visible, a man in dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches converged. The Japanese sniper faced eastward, monitoring the trail where George's battalion had been transporting supplies. George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks right for wind compensation. He controlled his respiration. The Winchester's trigger responded smoothly at 3.5 pounds. He had invested hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war commenced. Now he would determine if a civilian target rifle could eliminate a man trained to eliminate him first. George applied pressure to the trigger. The Winchester kicked against his shoulder. The report cracked through the jungle. 240 yards distant, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell, dropping through the branches. His body tumbled 90 feet and struck the ground near the banyan tree's base. George worked the bolt mechanism. The empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round and maintained his scope on the tree, waiting for movement. Nothing appeared. The sniper's partner would be nearby. Japanese snipers operated in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 observer. If George had just eliminated the shooter, the observer was positioned somewhere in that tree or in the neighboring trees. George scanned the surrounding banyans. The scope's 2.5 power magnification required him to search deliberately. Each tree could conceal multiple men. The jungle canopy created shadows that rendered shapes indistinguishable without careful observation. At 9:43, he located the second sniper. A different tree, 60 yards north of the first position. This one occupied a lower position, approximately 50 feet elevated. The Japanese soldier was descending the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and recognized his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backward off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both rifle and body struck the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots discharged, 2 eliminations achieved. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands remained steady, his breathing controlled. This differed little from shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets returned fire. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact dispersed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had originated from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before repositioning. He inched back to his firing position and examined the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have relocated after taking the shot basic sniper doctrine: shoot and relocate. But in jungle this dense, relocation options were constrained. George found him at 11:38, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet elevated. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. A tactical error. George placed the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without producing sound. By noon, George had eliminated 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread throughout the battalion. Soldiers who had mocked his mail-order rifle now requested permission to observe him work. George refused. Spectators attracted attention. Attention attracted fire. Following the fifth elimination, the Japanese snipers adapted. They ceased movement during daylight hours. George spent the afternoon examining trees and observing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery had vanished from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd commenced with rain-heavy tropical precipitation that transformed the jungle floor into mud and rendered the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain ceased at 8:15. By 8:45, sufficient visibility had returned for operations. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain intelligent. The sound of rain masked movement. This sniper had selected a tree 290 yards out longer range than the previous day. Also intelligent, they were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell. The sixth elimination brought a response George had not anticipated. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began impacting the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short, the second salvo landed 20 yards short, the third salvo would strike the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater. As the third salvo hit, the bunker he had occupied moments before disappeared in explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a different position, a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. They were now hunting him in return. The dynamic had shifted. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. At 14:23, George killed his seventh sniper. At 15:41, he killed his eighth. This one had climbed high 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good concealment existed, but the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed eliminations over 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 eliminations, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 now eliminated, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and attempted to sleep. At 300 hours, he abandoned the effort and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved. George began examining trees. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out low, only 40 feet elevated, unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sightlines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George was not at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks. The angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was incorrect. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George examined the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. He checked every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet elevated. The Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there, or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George faced 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was not at the fallen tree and begin searching for him. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it a slight shift. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 eliminations. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed examining trees. 10 confirmed eliminations, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible but not identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch or a man. George had to study each one carefully. At 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George saw the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape moving through the undergrowth, parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using the jungle floor vegetation for cover: ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work, the ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had watched the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yards. An easy shot even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who had been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy, another bait position. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning, just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He could not shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water. Slowly, silently, he brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Voices, Japanese voices coming from the tree line, multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers had not been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Winchester he held vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men. Maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. These were not snipers' infantry. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds. The voices stopped at the location of the first body 42 yards from his crater, close enough that he could hear them clearly, even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation, urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He had not been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum, poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options. Stay hidden and hope they passed by, or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting. More soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices. He ran 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low. He examined the area through his scope, saw movement, 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier, fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. One group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact, move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock, water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again, not running, walking, staying low, using the terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices, no movement, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits. Then, a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills. 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action. Water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every component. Cosmoline and gun oil. Patches run through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. George walked to headquarters, wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time and rifles with optics and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with Unitel scope sniper rifles left behind by the Marines. and Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with unilateral scopes went to the men George would train. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They had qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards, but none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment. George started with the fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the unilateral scopes. Heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the rifles stable but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, the roles could switch. This kept both men proficient and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers, just infantry stragglers who had not yet evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day, 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was conservative, only counted confirmed kills where the body could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he would recover but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days, 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission. Something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth. George did not know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet. The men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5,307th Composite Unit was officially designated on May 28, 1943, but the men had been training since April. Long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, operations without supply lines. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces that could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role was not officially listed as sniper. The Army did not have formal sniper positions in its table of organization. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the principles remained the same: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma jungle would be worse: steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American force. George modified his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but that had been short-range operations with regular resupply. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. The Weaver had the same 2.5 power magnification, but weighed 8 ounces less. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the Mietkina airfield. The airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large forces. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. The force would carry all supplies on their backs or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles and mortars and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They had engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights, followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders were not meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines, and create chaos behind Japanese positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards against a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, different from the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Mietkina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than combat malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 effectives. On May 17th, the marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost had been severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived, but the rifle that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range precision shooting that required a scoped rifle. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. George realized something during those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent rifle, perhaps the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made, but modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would require different weapons, different tactics. But there would be no next war for George. Not immediately. By June of 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July of 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he had learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma, how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The need for individual marksmen with privately owned rifles was fading. The military was standardizing mass production, interchangeable parts, soldiers with identical equipment and identical training. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare required industrial scale. But something was being lost. The individual skill, the craftsman approach to soldiering, the idea that a man with the right rifle and the right training could change the outcome of a battle. George was discharged from the Army in January of 1947. Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics, graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he had served in the Pacific, but they did not know about Point Cruz. They did not know about the Japanese snipers. They did not know about the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. In 1947, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for publication, just for his own record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant. The book was technical, detailed descriptions of rifles and ammunition and ballistics, not the kind of content that interested general readers. But the NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision, no embellishment, no hero worship, just facts and observations about what worked and what did not work in combat. The book is still in print today, still used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but it is not. It is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about riflemen who prove themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John George doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.